There is a quiet departure unfolding across the world, one that makes no sound and seeks no witness. Those who have looked deeply into themselves, who have questioned the nature of their minds and the meaning of their lives, are stepping away, not in anger, not in disdain, but with a kind of solemn clarity. You may have noticed it among your own circle or perhaps within yourself. The one who once spoke loudly now speaks softly. The one who once sought recognition now seeks silence. The one who once played every social game now slips gently out of the room. Ralph Waldo Emerson understood this movement long before our age named it. He believed that the soul, once awakened to its own truth, cannot continue to live imprisoned in the expectations of others. The world calls it withdrawal. Emerson called it returning to oneself. Society as we know it draws its shape from shared illusions, unspoken agreements about what matters, who we must appear to be, and how we must speak to be accepted. These agreements make the world predictable, but they also make the spirit small. Most people move through life with their inner world dimmed, their instincts hushed, their individuality reduced to a costume that pleases the collective gaze. But something happens when a person awakens psychologically. They begin to see the scaffolding of the world, the striving, the performance, the mimicry of thought and feeling. They see how humans speak, not to communicate truth, but to maintain belonging. They see how many live not as themselves, but as echoes of the nearest influence. And once a person sees this clearly, participation begins to hurt, not metaphorically. Not poetically, but bodily, emotionally, somatically. The awakened person finds themselves sitting among conversations that feel hollow, gestures that feel rehearsed, social interactions that feel like theater. They suddenly notice how much of life asks them to pretend. Pretend not to notice what is obvious. Pretend to agree with what feels false. Pretend to be asleep among sleepers, even though the inner eyes are now open. And so the soul withdraws. First subtly, then unmistakably. This withdrawal is not a rejection of humanity, but a refusal to betray the self. Emerson wrote that to be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. Yet what he did not need to say aloud, but implied through a lifetime of solitude and witness, is that this accomplishment requires distance. The self cannot hear itself in the noise of social demand. Consciousness cannot stay upright when pulled in every direction by unexamined minds, so the awakened person begins to step away from conversations where truth is unwelcome, from relationships that require them to be smaller than they are, from careers that silence the soul for the sake of performance, from environments that trade authenticity for approval. This stepping away is not dramatic. It is gentle, like a leaf letting go of the branch when its season is done. At first, the world around them may not notice, but the individual feels the shift immediately. They are no longer motivated by the same desires. Praise loses its sweetness. Status loses its shine. Belonging loses its necessity. What once mattered now feels like an echo from a previous life. They begin to experience a different form of loneliness, one that does not come from the lack of company, but from the lack of resonance. Surrounded by others, they feel unseen, as though their soul speaks a language no one else remembers. This is the solitude of consciousness. To be awake in a room where others are dreaming is to feel both free and painfully alone. The awakened person smiles when expected, listens politely, nods at the right moments. Yet inside, there is a quiet ache, a sense of exile, a recognition that something essential within them has outgrown the space they are standing in. And there comes a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes thunderous, when the psyche refuses to continue the performance. The inner voice says, "Enough." Not with anger, but with clarity. Not as rebellion, but as necessity. The awakened person realizes that staying among the unconscious does not merely feel uncomfortable, it is harmful. It drains the spirit. It asks the mind to dim itself. It asks the heart to pretend it does not feel what it feels, and so the soul chooses solitude, not as escape, not as isolation, but as protection of what has finally come alive. For consciousness is fragile when it first awakens. It is like a flame flickering in the wind. In the early stages, it must be guarded, sheltered from the cold breath of consensus that would extinguish its light. The world will not understand this withdrawal. It will call it antisocial, dramatic, selfish, or strange. But Emerson would say that the world has always misunderstood the one who follows the inner law rather than the outer. For nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. When you honor that integrity, you will be asked to walk alone for a time. Not forever, only until your strength is rooted. Your truth is steady, and your voice can remain your own. Even in the company of many, this is the beginning of the journey inward, the necessary departure, before the deeper transformation as the awakened withdraw from the familiar world. Something profound begins to unfold inside them. The noise that once filled their days grows quiet. The endless obligations, the subtle internal recoil, the forced performance of being a someone in the eyes of others. These begin to fall away like old garments that no longer fit. And beneath that shedding, the true self finally begins to breathe. Yet this solitude is not immediately peaceful. The first stage is disorientation. When you step away from the collective identity, you must face the one that is truly yours. And at first it may feel like nothing. A space, a silence, a question. What remains when you are no longer performing? This is the threshold Jung and Emerson both stood before. The point where the self realizes that every identity it wore was shaped to meet the expectations of others. The smiling face, the agreeable words, the polite silence, the persona, a mask designed for acceptance, not truth. The awakened person begins to see how much of their life was built around avoiding rejection. How many opinions were borrowed? How many desires were inherited? How many values were never examined? Only absorbed. To withdraw from the collective is to finally stand in front of the mirror of your own soul, without costume, without audience, without applause. And what you find there is not always comfortable. You discover your shadow, not the darkness of evil, but the darkness of truth. The emotions you were trained to hide, the thoughts you were told to suppress, the longing you were discouraged from speaking, the strength you were never permitted to claim. Most people avoid this confrontation by staying busy, busy with noise, busy with others, busy with distraction. But when you withdraw, there is nowhere left to hide. The silence becomes a field of revelation, and while this can feel like unraveling, it is actually integration. Emerson believed that each person contains a private law, a truth that is theirs alone to live, and that violating this law is the true source of suffering. Solitude is the furnace in which this law becomes visible. Without the crowd to tell you who to be, you finally hear who you are. But here is where a deeper challenge appears. When the awakened return briefly to society, to a conversation, a workplace, a gathering, they feel it immediately, the collective unconscious pressing back upon them. Not with hostility, but with gravity. A pull to resume the old shape, the old language, the old way of being. It is not intentional, it is atmospheric. Groups, systems, workplaces, families, cultures, they all possess an unspoken agreement about how reality is to be experienced. The awakened, having stepped outside this agreement, now stand in a different light. And when they try to speak from that light, their words fall like rain on unprepared soil. They are misunderstood, not because they are unclear, but because they are speaking from a depth others are not yet aware exists. This is where loneliness enters, not the loneliness of being without people, but the loneliness of being without resonance. The awakened person knows that most conflicts between individuals, groups, or nations are not about truth or principle, but about the unconscious projection of unacknowledged pain. They see that blame is rarely about the other and almost always about the self. They see that the loudest voices are often the most frightened. and that certainty is frequently a disguise for fear, and once seen, this cannot be unseen. To participate would require pretending not to know, and the awakened cannot return to sleep. So the withdrawal deepens, not as retreat but as alignment, not as escape but as honesty. Those around them may misunderstand. They may say, "You've changed, you're distant, you're not the same." And the awakened will know, "Yes, I am finally not the same." The path now turns inward, into what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who the world trained you to be. This process requires solitude, not to avoid others, but to prevent being reshaped by their unconscious expectations. And during this time, something extraordinary happens. The awakened begin to build a new center of gravity, not outside, but within. Their sense of self no longer depends on approval, social belonging, or recognition. Their value no longer fluctuates based on comparison. Their emotions no longer seek permission to exist. They begin to live from the root, not the surface, and slowly the exhaustion that once consumed them begins to lift. The fatigue was not from life, but from performing life. The weight was not from responsibility, but from inauthenticity. The sorrow was not from solitude, but from living without the self. In this quiet, the psyche repairs itself. Energy returns. Clarity returns. Strength, once scattered in every direction, gathers like a river finding its course. The awakened now understand why the old world felt unbearable, not because the world was unkind, but because they were no longer meant to live inside its dream. The hermit phase is not a disappearance from life. It is a return to life. It is the soul, reminding itself that truth cannot be lived while one is surrounded by noise, and the silence is not empty. It is rich with meaning. The world outside has many voices, but the inner world has one. And when you finally hear it, you stop seeking answers elsewhere. This is the purpose of the withdrawal. Not to escape the collective, but to become someone who can one day re-enter it without losing themselves. But here is the most important thing Jung wanted you to understand. You are not meant to stay withdrawn forever. The hermit phase is not the destination. It is the initiation. The purpose of disappearing is not to remain unseen, but to return as someone who cannot be undone by the world. Because when the self is fully formed, something shifts. You no longer enter rooms trying to be understood. You enter simply being, and those who are capable will understand. You no longer adjust your expression to make others comfortable. You speak from truth, not performance. You no longer search for your place. Your presence becomes its own place. The awakened don't return to convince the world. They don't preach. They don't argue. They don't debate. They embody, and embodiment changes others without a single word. This is why the return is subtle, quiet, almost invisible. The awakened re-enter life like a whisper, not a trumpet. They move differently. They listen differently. They see differently. They stop reacting and start responding. They stop absorbing and start observing. They stop explaining and simply live in alignment. And this has an effect. People around them begin to feel something, a different frequency, a different rhythm, a different way of existing. Some will feel uncomfortable. Some will feel inspired. Some will feel confused. But those who are ready will come closer. These are the ones who are also beginning to see through the collective unconscious. The ones exhausted by the performance. The ones who feel the pull to disappear, but don't yet understand why. And you will become the quiet signal for them, not their teacher, not their savior, not their guide, just proof. Proof that awakening is real. Proof that authenticity is possible. Proof that peace exists outside performance. This is the return Jung spoke of. Not a return to society's center, but to its edges, its living borders, where old structures dissolve and new forms emerge. Awakened people don't rebuild the old world. They build parallel worlds, small circles of real conversation, friendships rooted in truth, not identity, work that expresses the soul, not the persona, Communities without performance, lives that are simple, deep, and quietly powerful. They become what Jung called carriers of the future, not by preaching change, but by being the change that others will recognize when their time comes. So if you are withdrawing right now, if social gatherings feel hollow, if conversation feels scripted, if the world feels louder than your inner voice, there is nothing wrong with you. You are not failing. You are not losing touch. You are not breaking. You are transitioning. You are stepping out of the collective dream and entering your own reality. This is not the end of your life. This is the beginning of your authentic one. Do not rush the hermit phase. Do not fear the silence. Do not apologize for disappearing. You are not here to remain what others recognize. You are here to become what only you can recognize. And when you will return not to fit in, but to stand, not to speak louder, but to speak truer, not to awaken the world, but to be awake in it. Your task is not to change others. Your task is to never again abandon yourself. The disappearance was your initiation. The return will be your embodiment. Until then, withdraw with purpose. Rest inside your truth. Let your soul finish its rearrangement. When you are whole, the world will meet you differently.